right, my ELA teacher friends, Christian Kuhn coming at you, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. And if you've seen, I've started a new Facebook group for ELA State Exams, and we're going to focus on writing strategies. So if you haven't yet, please join that Facebook group. Today, in this writing workshop, I'm going to focus on the New York State Regents exam. I teach in New York State, have for 22 years, and our on-level juniors take this exam at the end of every year in June. And what I would like to do today is focus on part 2, which is the source-based argument. And one of the reasons why I formed that Facebook group as a lead teacher for the National Writing Project and a main contributor to NCTE is this. I think a lot of teachers teach in isolation. We kind of teach in this vacuous box where we think we're so different from everyone else. And really what I want to emphasize is the fact that what I'm doing in my class as far as manipulating my heuristics, my templates, it's applicable for the states of Florida, Illinois, Massachusetts, California, Texas, Kentucky, Georgia, Maryland. A lot of these state tests have source-based argument prompts that look just like part 2 of the New York State Regents exam. So what I would like you to do is look at my exemplars and models. I'm going to Bob Ross how to write this essay from start to finish while pulling the strings of my templates, and then see how you could use these skill sets, these templates for your particular state. And just as a caveat, I will be making videos for those states in due time to show the overlap. So let's jump right in. First, let's start with the directions for part 2, the argument-based synthesis prompt. So the directions state, closely read each of the 4 texts provided on pages 13 through 20 and write a source-based argument on the topic below. You may use the margins to take notes as you read and scrap paper to plan your response. Write your argument beginning on page 1 of your essay booklet. And then here's the topic. And they're going to unpack this a little more. I'll do that on my next slide. The topic is, should elementary age children receive participation awards in sports? Here's the kicker about this. As I've reviewed a whole bunch of state exams, typically you get an essential question on the argument-based synthesis paper. And here's what I mean by that. You get an essential question and the kid's thesis is either going to answer the question with a yes, a no, or a qualify. And those are the only 3 directions that the thesis can go. You can say yes to this question, you can say no, or you can qualify it. And even though this one's focusing in particular on participation awards, other states do the exact same thing in terms of their wording. It's very similar to FRQ1 on the AP Lang exam. It's no different. So synthesis is synthesis is synthesis, no matter how you slice it. So in terms of the task, let's see what we have going on here. It says, carefully read each of the 4 texts provided. Then, using evidence from at least 3 of the texts, write a well-developed argument regarding whether or not elementary age children should receive participation awards in sports. Clearly establish your claim, distinguish your claim from alternate or opposing claims, and use specific, relevant, and sufficient evidence from at least 3 of the texts to develop your argument. Do not simply summarize each text. So I've been teaching AP Lang for 22 years, and the Regents board in New York State piggybacks the language and the verbiage of the College Board with regard to FRQ1, the synthesis paper on the AP language exam. So this is no different. So again, kids need to say yes, no, or it depends. They need to use 3 of the 4 sources, and they have to make sure that they maintain the centrality of their argument. So how do you do that? First, let me answer that question by stating this. You got to Bob Ross your instruction. What I've done for all of you and your students, if you choose to run this writing workshop for your students, is I have painted a whole bunch of models and exemplars for you. And that's what I mean by Bob Ross, your instruction. So Bob Ross used a template. He referred to it as a heuristic called the wet on wet technique. And every time he stood at the canvas, at the easel, he employed the wet on wet technique, no matter the natural landscape that he was capturing. And for my students, no matter the expository mode, and you'll see this in just a second, you can either declare or invert the thesis, and all body paragraphs are going to be using the syllogistic method. So whether we're doing synthesis, argument, persuasion, lit analysis, rhetorical analysis, and even research. Those are the three heuristics that we're going to use. And I often say heuristics. Other teachers refer to it as a template. I'm going to use them interchangeably throughout this presentation. So kids read that prompt, those directions. They read over the source packet, and then they ask themselves intuitively the following question. So, how do I write the introductory paragraph? And guess what? It's pretty easy. We can boil it down to two directional points. The first is the declarative thesis, right? And the second one is the inverted. I'll start with declarative. When kids declare the thesis, they begin with the thesis. So you take that essential question and boom, right out of the gate, just drop the answer to the question. Therefore, you get the thesis. So the answer to the question is always going to be the thesis. From there, you want to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background, but there are some very big do not do's in that. Do not summarize any of the articles. Do not quote the articles. Do not even mention anything from the source packet. Your argument must be central. So it's context and background surrounding either the yes, the no, or the qualification. Other things that I like my students to do is to include some tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber word. I run intensive word study academies throughout the year. I literally have hundreds of vocab acquisition exercises, and I have a few in my YouTube channel, and I will definitely put more on there as I build my channel. But the thing is, in 22 years of teaching, I know that kids come each year with a seismic paucity of verbiage, a seismic lack in their lexicons. And it's not because kids are reading less. I think kids are reading just as much as they ever have. It's just they're not reading text-rich things like kids in past generations did. So I like to see a healthy amount of academic diction, but I always give the caveat that using $1 million words is not the equivalent of good writing. I want kids to stay in their wheelhouse, sound natural, not be overly pedantic, pretentious, contrived, but elevated, their academic best self. The other thing I like to see in the introduction are sentence constructs. Many of you know that I use a text called Strunk and White to write it right. It's a free manual. You can find free PDFs of it online. I throw it in Google Classroom all year long, and I have built hundreds and thousands of assignments around the rules that Strunk and White have concocted in that manual. And they have something called rule number 18. Rule number 18 makes the assertion that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So I'm all about teaching kids voice, rhythm, flow. In the AP world, we call it the elusive sophistication point. Even with on-level juniors, I want them to write at a sophisticated level. So my students get pretty decent if they give me an iota of effort with manipulating their syntax so that they have achieved good voice, rhythm, and flow, and I'll model that in my exemplars. And then the last one, the kicker, every introductory paragraph is going to be 4 sentences long. No more, no less, exactly 4 sentences. So no matter which writing workshop you see me Bob Ross for, all of my introductions are 4 sentences long, no matter the expository mode. We can flip that declarative upside down on its head and invert the thesis. And all we're doing here is we're going to start with the context and background instead of the thesis statement. Kids might begin with a hook or an analogy, and you end with the thesis. So the fourth sentence is going to answer the essential question. And then you just sprinkle in all the status quo stuff. We want that context and background. Tier 2 sentence constructs, exactly 4 sentences long. So let's bust out some exemplars and models and see what this looks like on paper. Here is exemplar number 1. I'll read it and then I'll unpack it for you, and you can see kind of how we're pulling the strings of the heuristic here. And also note too, I think when I say template, teachers are expecting sentence stems. I don't do that with my students. I find it to be very paint by number and artificial, and I want students to be thinking on their own. So that's why I refer to it more as a heuristic than a template, because template has this like connotative quality that you're going to equip kids with sentence stems. I don't do that. So it's more of a heuristic than a template. So see what we have here in exemplar number 1. Not unless the intent is to breed generational complacency and entitlement, then participation trophies at the elementary level should absolutely be tossed to the curb. Instead of bubble wrapping kids' feelings, the adults in their lives need to instill the values of grit, hard work, and commitment. Sports, in a sense, are a microcosm of the real world. And one must remember, nothing is given away for free once these kids leave the haven of the sandlot. So let's break this down. The first sentence very clearly articulates the thesis statement. So that first sentence identifies this particular introductory paragraph as a declarative paradigm, right? The declarative model. So read that sentence again. It clearly answers the question. Not unless the intent is to breed generational complacency and entitlement, then participation trophies at the elementary level should absolutely be tossed to the curb. So it clearly answers the question. You can see that the other 3 sentences are just context and background that ensure that the argument stays central. There is some real nice tier 2 level vocab in here. So I think from a junior perspective, words like intent, generational, complacency work really nice. Grit is a good word, microcosm. So a fair amount of tier 2 level word, but again, stay in the wheelhouse. Don't invent words. Don't use like $1 million words that don't quite fit the square hole there. And make sure you're in your wheelhouse. Also look at the sentence constructs. Here's my advice to kids. I tell them not to parallel their sentences. So let's say, for example, that a student, in sentence 1 uses an adjective clause. Then sentence 2 should not be an adjective clause. You always want to stagger your sentences and parallel only if you have a reason to. So you'll see when we get into the syllogistic body paragraphs, in the conclusions of those syllogisms, kids often will stack a few independent clauses atop each other or short, simple declaratives. It's because they're hammering home their point and there's an intention behind it. Usually, if kids are paralleling, it's an indication that they're a struggling and emerging writer. And we got to break that pattern to get better voice rhythm and flow. So that might be confounding. So let's do it again. I'm going to model this a number of times. And this is what I mean by Bob Rossing your instruction. The more you show your kids, the more you demystify it. So exemplar number 2 looks like this. I'll read it and I'll unpack it again for you. Just as a matter of fact, most elementary school age kids are extrinsically motivated. So you can see there, this is going to be inverted because that did not answer the question. So you start with the context, you start with the background. As such, they place high value on the veritable pats on the back they receive from the adults in their lives, such as teachers and coaches. Without frequent encouragement to prompt kids to grow and mature in any skill they are trying to acquire, most will invariably shut down emotionally and quit. Given this, elementary age children should unquestionably receive participation trophies, win or lose, because at this age there are no losers. So that last sentence answers the essential question, so it's inverted. The vocab is up again. Good words like extrinsic, veritable is very good, invariably. So the vocab's there. And you'll also note, like in exemplar number 1, I used a dash. And this one, I'm just flexing for the kids, just showing them how to do it. And I don't want to be hyperbolic about it or like, not authentic. But I got a semicolon in here. I got a dash. So really good sentence variation. Everything is staggered and it flows nice. And it's exactly 4 sentences long. So yes, you can. You can do this. I know kids might look at this and be like, ooh, that's hard. It's really not that hard. The more you practice it and the more you keep it consistent and static, the easier it gets. So knowing that kids might be confused, I did it a 3rd time. Look at this one. In comparison to the likes of my parents' and grandparents' generation, kids today are soft and extremely self-entitled. So I'm anticipating that the answer to the question is going to come in the 4th sentence, and this will likewise be inverted. The difference is this, and again, note this, colon, right? So I want my kids to use a variety of syntactical features. Everything is handed out for free these days. Conversely, previous generations had to work their tails off to advance in life and society. Now, note the articulation of the answer to the question here. In order to instill the right value system into elementary age kids, such as hard work, commitment, and dedication, participation trophies should cease to be a thing, right? So we answered the question right there. Boom, bingo, good, in and out, 4 sentences. Vocab up, sentence structures are nice and flowy, supple, and that's how you rock and roll. All right, let's paint one more just to really shore this up, solidify it, demystify it, take all the ambiguity and mystery out of it. Look at number 4. Perhaps more than any other age demographic, elementary age students should absolutely be granted participation trophies. So that answers the essential question. So this is declarative. Now let's just focus on context background, unpack it, unflesh it a little bit, flesh it out, and keep the vocab up, focus on the sentence constructs. Sure, the world is a cruel place that separates along the lines of winners and losers. But adults are obligated to protect kids from this dog-eat-dog world, especially at such a vulnerable age. There is nothing wrong with giving a kid a token gesture to acknowledge their dedication, commitment, and resolve to put forth their best effort. To not acknowledge these traits is quite simply cruel. It's doing the same thing, so it doesn't matter. Begin with the thesis or end with the thesis. Decide, am I going to declare or am I going to invert? And I'll say this as an aside. When kids, after you Bob Ross and kids are looking at a blank sheet of paper or a blank screen and they're like, I don't know what to do. And you're like, dude, I just showed you 4 times how to do it. Come on, don't buy into learned helplessness. Don't be a victim to your own defeatism. I often say this. I pose the question. I say, in your own words, answer the question. And as soon as they begin to answer, I say, write that down. And that's a declarative thesis. That's one way to get kids unstuck. All right, so go paint some happy little intros at this stage of the game if you're following along. I would pause the video here and have your students write an introduction, either declare, invert, and maybe you want to draft a couple as well so that you can be a veritable Bob Ross of composition. So intros are done. Next question is this. So how do I write the body paragraphs? And those that are familiar with my work, you're going to say, holy cow, this guy ain't joking. He's for real. Every single time you can use the syllogistic method, regardless of the expository mode. So I'm going to do a quick, brief flyby of the syllogistic method. If you want to do a deeper dive into how I teach inductive and deductive reasoning, hop into the YouTube channel and browse some videos. So I'll give you a working understanding of it here. So the syllogistic method is rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the town boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling, and they would often throw out their own juicy essential questions. And one quintessential one is this: what is justice? Which many of you know is the essential question to the seminal text, Plato's Republic. And the scholars and the philosophers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And the other scholars and philosophers would gather around in a circle and find all the bullet holes in that logic. And Aristotle said this, kind of like what composition teachers do. Why is it that some of my students excel at this, some are men, some tank bomb? And he studied the real exceptional orators, and he said, I got it, aha, I got it, eureka moment. My really good orators are mathematical and computative. They have bulletproof, cogent logic, and they're following a formula. And he said, I'm going to call this the syllogistic method. And all the syllogistic method is when you argue from premise to a conclusion. So a body paragraph is going to consist of these three parts. So if I were to say premise number 1, arsenic is deadly, you would all nod your head and say, yep, Christian, you are 100% correct. But then if I say, geez, my dog ate arsenic, you're going to naturally conclude, uh-oh, Christian, this is not going to bode well for your dog. It's going to die, right? Aristotle would call that a cogent argument. In composition, we call it line of reasoning. And ultimately, whether you call it cogency or line of reasoning, this is what I'm talking about. Good writing is good thinking. And this heuristic that I'm going to show you is an excellent template or heuristic to house thought on paper. So let's break down the parts for the purposes of doing argument-based synthesis. So the syllogistic method will look like this. The first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. Note up top in those 4 examples in the introductory paragraphs, we did not answer the question why. We just say yes, no, or qualified. That's it. You don't give your why reasons. You're going to hold that off for the first body paragraph. So you get a why reason. And that first premise is going to be 3 sentences long. It's not an arbitrary number. I want it to be 3 sentences long to keep the centrality of the argument. The biggest pitfall or snafu that kids commit in synthesis writing is they begin to piggyback the sources too early up in the body paragraph. And by default, and by doing so, they've lost the centrality of their argument. They end up, borrowing theses from the sources, and you don't want to do that. Your argument must be central. The second premise begins in the 4th sentence, and that's where the textual support comes in. And I like to see a good teeter-totter balance between quoting and paraphrasing. And then I really want to be mindful in articulating this. Body paragraphs need conclusions. You have to wrap up the body paragraph. So it's first premise, second premise, conclude the body paragraph. And that's going to be the textual analysis. And I call it links, echoes, promise. The first premise is a promise that you make to your reader to sustain the line of reasoning. And then you link it and echo it all back to the prompt and the thesis. Now, all of this is going to take 10 to 12 sentences. And I'll articulate that one very clearly because sometimes that confuses people. A syllogistic body paragraph, again, no matter the expository mode, is going to be 10 to 12 sentences. My big contention is this. Students that write those 4 or 5 sentence baggers, they don't have enough support or analysis to really advance an argument. So I like 10 to 12 sentences for full, supple, well-argued, pithy arguments. All right, next question. So how do I write a first premise? And here I will introduce to you a couple stems that I give my students. I'm not big on stems because I don't want to steal the thunder from my students and feed them with words and my thoughts and ideas, because then I'm writing the essay for them. So I'm very leery of stems, but you will invariably have a struggling emerging writer who says, what's a why reason? How do I write a why reason? And they just can't get their head around it. So for your real struggling emerging writer, have them steal one of these sentence stems. To get to the reason why, if you say there is a clear reason as to why, or there are a couple of reasons you should, something along those lines, something akin to that, then the student by default will articulate the why reason. So steal those if you want them. Now let me put it all into 3 sentences. Here's exemplar number 1 for a first premise. I'm going to use that sentence stem. There are a couple of reasons as to why participation trophies need to cease to be a thing in our society. First, the reason why parents enroll their children into these types of activities is to prepare their kids for the proverbial real world. Second, one must remember that once these kids become adults, there are no free token gifts for simply showing up. All right, so I already said this earlier, but let me unpack it. The first premise is a promise. I did something here that I call the enumerated approach. Do you see how I say first and then second? It's a great way to drop the seeds for your line of reasoning. So as I move into the fourth sentence, which is the transition to the second premise, I need quotes and or paraphrases for the first and quotes and or paraphrases for the second, and I need to go in that methodical order. All right, so that's one example of a first premise. Let's remove the training wheels, get rid of the sentence stems, and just hammer out a why reason without all of the additives. So here is an example, just straight up why reason. The principal goal of youth sports is to foster a strong sense of intrinsic motivation in each individual child. But in saying this, one's internal drive is typically fed by external rewards, especially when it comes to younger children. And this is the point of participation trophies, to reinforce the habits of mind and qualities a kid will need to be an extremely effective and productive adult. So what's the promise of the first premise, and what quotes and or paraphrases do I now need to go get? So basically, I need to talk about how we're nurturing little kids to become successful and independent adults, and that these participation awards help foster that transition into adulthood. So I would need a whole bunch of quotes and paraphrases to do that. We know that I have to use a total of 3 sources in the essay. So go quote hunting, go find it out. All right, next question. What's after the first premise? And I've alluded to this. Go quote hunting. So after I write my first premise, I always stop, open up my packet, my source packet, and get all the quotes that I need, all the paraphrases. And then I need to make sure that I'm keeping the promise of the first premise. So if I'm talking about, it not being a fair representation of the macro cosmic world, then I need quotes that align with that. So when you go quote hunting, you got to be very deliberate. You have to be very methodical and make sure that you're sustaining that line of reasoning. Another way to put it is this: keep your promise. When we begin to talk about cogency and line of reasoning, all it really is promise keeping. So we got to make sure that we keep the promise of the first premise. So let's take it from the top, and I'll show you the whole syllogistic body paragraph. So here's my first premise, and I am going to use the sentence stems for this. There are a couple of reasons as to why participation trophies need to cease to be a thing in our society. First, the reason why parents enroll their children into these types of activities is to prepare their kids for the proverbial real world. Second, one must remember that once these kids become adults, there are no free token gifts for simply showing up. So I ask you that are watching this, what's my promise? Like, what am I getting at here? You got to go to the first and say, what are you promising when you say first? Go to second, what are you promising when you say second? And then you go in that order in terms of your quote hunting and your paraphrase digging. So let's transition to the fourth sentence. Fourth sentence begins the second premise, and I tell my students, immediately get quoting, get into your sources. So look what I've done here. Several professional athletic coaches concur, such as Vince Lombardi, in that he's gone on record as saying that youth sports are intended to prepare elementary age kids for the rough and tumble hard knocks of the grown-up world. Source C. So do you see the fourth sentence you should be quoting? That quote is perfectly aligned to what I said in the first. When I said first, right? That's the absolute best quote. So this heuristic helps your kids quote with deliberation to help them sustain the line of reasoning. If you quote, you got to analyze it. You just can't quote dump. So look how I unpack this quote. In many ways, any type of schooling, whether it be athletics or even clubs, is a microcosmic experience of what kids will invariably face once they reach adulthood. And the reality is this: if all an employee does is show up and offer nothing more, then it stands to reason that this individual will not be employed for long. Further, the good of every parent, the goal of every parent is to raise confident children who one day will flee the nest and thrive in life. Participation trophies conversely reinforce the idea that one can get something for nothing. Top business moguls like Steve Jobs have indicated that the participation trophy culture of today's generation has fostered a collective workforce wholly unsuited for the rigors of the modern day workforce. And that comes from source D. Let me talk about my quote transitions. There's kind of like a template or a heuristic within the heuristic. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational. And that's what I've done in my exemplar here as I've Bob Ross this. You also noted that I bracket quite a bit. You have to teach kids that to keep it conversational. Oftentimes brackets will be your friend. And then yet again, I quoted, I need to analyze it. And Jobs is correct. In comparative terms, the participation trophy kids get fired at alarming rates. The graph in source B suggests that there is a cross-generational difference of 57%. Right? So I got 3 sources in there just to model how to do it. I used the graph, I used Vince Lombardi, I used Steve Jobs. And now I got to be mindful, right? We're shooting for 10 to 12 sentences. So I'm not done yet. I can't end on a quote. I have to wrap this sucker up. So how do you wrap it up? How do you put a bow on this? Well, the conclusion of the body paragraph usually takes 2 to 3 sentences. And again, I link, echo, promise. I throw it all back. A syllogism's a circle. So look where this goes. You end where you begin in many ways. Being too soft on kids is not without its consequences. Sports are just one activity to prepare kids for the next stage of their life. So it stands to reason that these activities should mirror reality as much as possible. And again, just a couple of sentences, wrap it up, go back to the prompt, go back to the thesis, keep the promise of the first premise. So at this stage of the game, we are an introduction in, we are one body paragraph in. The question is this: what do I do next? And the answer is simple. You bust out another syllogism. This is a 4-paragraph essay. And those of you that follow my work, you know that for my AP language and AP literature students, they likewise write 4-paragraph essays. If you get kids away from the 4 or 5 sentence bag or body paragraph, there's really no need to do a 5-paragraph essay on an exam, because you got your intro, 4 sentences. Body paragraph 1, 10 to 12 sentences. Body paragraph 2, 10 to 12 sentences. You've covered everything, and then you just throw a conclusion paragraph on the end. So let's look at how we would do this. So you already used the stem. There are several reasons why, or there is a reason why. There are a couple of reasons why. So to avoid redundancy, you got to take the training wheel off. So this is how I would begin the second body paragraph. 3-sentence first premise. So always, always, always stick to the heuristic. Don't break the template. The principal goal of youth sports is to foster a strong sense of intrinsic motivation in each individual child. But in saying this, one's internal drive is typically fed by external rewards, especially when it comes to younger children. And this is the point of participation trophies. To reinforce the habits of mind and qualities a kid will need to be an extremely effective and productive adult. It's 3 sentences, a clearly articulated why reason. So you might ask, where does the kid go from here, right? And it's really that easy. You go quote hunting, just like we did. You got to get your paraphrases. You're shooting 10 to 12 sentence, 5-word rule, and work in, like 2 to 3 sources. So typically kids ask me, or they make the observation that when I write, I typically quote 3 times in a syllogistic body paragraph where I'm doing synthesis, but minimum of 2, because synthesis is a plural word. And if you're only quoting once, you're not really authentically doing any sort of synthesis whatsoever. So a minimum of 2, I tend to go 3. All right, so that's what the second body paragraph would look like. Let's wrap this essay up. What do we do for the conclusion? Well, I have some stems, and I just like my students to it's kind of like a 4th of July fireworks display, the grand finale, like really hammer theme, really hammer main idea. And it's just a move that requires 3 or 4 sentences. So one of my go-to stems is this: simply said, comma. So if you're writing along with me, you can steal that. Simply said, comma, and then finish it. So look what I did here. Simply said, comma, participation trophies send a terrible message to kids. Never again in their lives will they get free token gifts just for showing up. As such, the practice needs to cease. 3 sentences, boom, done. So I have a few other sentence stems that students like, and they are here. I got 4 of them. Evidentially, comma, and then just 3 or 4 sentences, finish it. In no other words, comma, finish it, 3 to 4 sentences. When it is all said and done, comma, finish it, 3 to 4 sentences. And then the last one, at the end of the day, comma, 3 or 4 sentences. And that is the whole essay right there. Now, here's the kicker as we wrap this up here. Keep in mind that many states have this argument-based synthesis prompt. You can use my heuristic just as well on your own state exam as we're doing here in New York State. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com is the best way to reach me. You can just drop an email and I'll be certain to get back to you. Also note that I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. We do professional development throughout the calendar year. And one area that I want to get into with them are these state exams. I think there's so much focus in the social media world, the social media realm, with AP exams. And for example, in my school, we have 17 people in my department, and only 2 of us teach AP. And we cater so much to AP that we forget, hey, what about the on-level teachers? And what about those of us that teach other exams? So that's what I'm doing in my Facebook group, and what I want to begin doing some more work with NWP and NCTE. So if you want more information on the comings and goings of what I'm doing with National Writing Project and NCTE, even work a little bit with Perfection Learning, then you can visit my website at www.teachinghowtowrite.com. In the upper left-hand tab, there's a link that says My NWP Courses, and you can see some of the PD that we offer. Some is free, but if it's paid, it's a nominal fee just to keep our doors open. And note that for those of you that need professional development hours for your credentials, that we always offer credential badges so that you can cash in and get your PD hours. So that's it from here. Happy teaching, happy writing. I hope this serves you well, and I will be writing exemplars and models. I'll Bob Ross your state exam soon enough, so stay tuned.